Well, I'm going over all of my fall films and TV shows. I don't normally do them every fall. I usually rotate them, but this year I thought I'd try to get them all in. Um, I have a long history with Silence of the Lambs. I remember in high school people talking about it, talking about how good it was. I've just never been the kind of person that someone tells me something is good and I believe them. I'm just not like that. If you tell me something's good, it's great, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be interested. I need to hear why it's good. Tell me why it's good, and then I got a little bit of a better idea. And if it sounds interesting to me, I still might not engage with it for years. I'm usually a latecomer to any kind of art or anything like that. I don't know why. I've always been that way. Anyway, and I had been hearing about, Silence of the Lambs. No one had said anything about it that made it sound good, so I didn't care how good they said it was. I went on a vacation with my stepbrother and my grandmother to St. Louis. It's a really good memory. And we spent the night at this hotel, and the only thing back then, this is, in the 90s, I was still in high school, you could rent a movie that night at the hotel room, and there really wasn't anything else that we wanted to rent but Silence of the Lambs. It was the only thing that seemed any good. So we thought my grandmother was asleep. And there's a scene where Clarice, a prisoner, throws something at her. And if you know anything about this movie, you know what it is. And my grandmother woke up and said, what did he throw? What did he do? I don't know. I said, he spit on her. Um, you're not going to talk to your grandmother about some things happening in this film. Um, and that's anyway. So it was quite a experience watching the movie for the first time. So much so I didn't watch it again for 25 years. I think a long time. I didn't watch the movie again for a very long time. And because my grandmother had passed away, um, one of my memories was that we had seen that, and so I decided to watch it, just kind of as a memory thing. And man, it made those years just rush back. It's such a 90s film. It really is. And it's funny, I've talked about this in my retrospective with movies. There's always a layover culturally from the previous decade, and, which is reasonable. Silence of the Lambs is no exception. The music is by Howard Shore. If you listen to it, man, it really sounds like the tail end of 80s movies. It does. In fact, my only complaint about Silence of the Lambs is the music. The music's just not quite there. It's good. It's actually good. It just sounds dated. It sounds old now whenever I listen to it. But that's part of the film. I'm kind of picky about music. If the movie has a dark theme like this, I prefer the music be dark, like Seven. The music's very dark in that film. It is fall. You should be having a cup of coffee right now. Go ahead and pause it and go grab a cup. Um, I'm doing this in multiple parts because my other deep dives and analysis have been very detailed and they're really long. And I just was like, it might be more interesting to keep this short. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to keep it short and then maybe do a part two and perhaps even a part three, depending on how much. But there's a lot to say about this. The next thing I want to talk about is, so you see Clarice, and she's in the FBI, and if you look, you really feel like this claustrophobic, they're in a basement almost feeling at Quantico. And it's remarkable that it is the same feeling as the asylum where she meets Hannibal Lecter. This is not an accident. I think this is quite intentional. And it's to show you that in both places, she's a woman in a man's world. Now, I'm telling you something that if you've never seen it, you cannot unsee it. Watch the reaction of males when she's at Quantico. Watch the reaction of males when she's in Baltimore at the asylum. you will see. They are. It is clearly saying this is a woman in a man's world. So you might get the impression that they filmed Quantico like the Asylum for the Criminally Insane, I think is what it's called, Baltimore Asylum for Criminally Insane, or something along those lines. You might get the impression that they're saying there's some physical stature that's similar, but they're not. They're simply saying that Clarice is a woman in a man's world. And this is fascinating, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more about this because this is a feminist film, and I've said many times, I just don't think feminism is a philosophy I'm even remotely interested in. And I'm going to make a video about some things going on in our culture that has to do with pushback against feminism. That I'm just kind of shocked people are buying into this, but we'll talk about it at some point. And there'll be more to say about it in this review. But I just want to say that in this particular case, this really works because it's talking about a universal idea that isn't necessarily just feminism. And that is this idea that anyone can, male, female, no matter what your race, you can feel like a fish out of water in many situations. So it makes her plight kind of universal. I think we've all experienced that, where we feel like we're in a place where we don't belong. And Clarice is that way everywhere she goes. She is absolutely in over her head, and that's really good storytelling. All right, next part I want to talk about. At the asylum. This shows the brilliance of this film. I have not read the book or any of Thomas Harris's books. I do want to, but I'm only reviewing here and analyzing the film. I'm not interested, even if I'd read the books, I might use some of that to help me with the interpretation, but I'm actually glad that I haven't read them because I want to talk about this in terms of the film itself, which is kind of impossible to do based on the experiences that you have. And you're going to see that as I continue here for various reasons, podcasts and so forth that I've listened to that, wasn't even about this movie, but it ended up analyzing this movie a little bit. And you can't, ignore that. But when she gets to the insane asylum, insane asylum, this film shows that it can work on two levels because there are two types of people who watch movies. Now, there are more, but I'm only interested in talking about two. The first type of person that just wants a great cinematic experience. That is available in spades. For that kind of person, what happens when she goes and visits Lecter is one of the best introductions to a villain you could possibly have. It's very dark. She goes in, there he is. He's starkly different from every other character you've seen in the film. There's a lot of focus on environment. When she's in Crawford's office, it shows the environment. And you see, like, if you haven't paid close attention, he has a couch, and there's bedding on the couch where he sleeps sometimes. And then there's a board, and pinned up on the board is Buffalo Bill and all the killings that they're trying to, all the news clippings from the killings. And then there's a little place where a bunch of people sit and analyze this and discuss it. When she's in Dr. Chilton's office, he's just sort of hitting on her, and this is all done by close-ups, which is really off-putting because you lose your peripheral vision. So you only see things he definitely intends for you to see. So you don't see a lot of Chilton's office. But then when she goes into the hall, right before the hall, she sees the security, and we get the entire environment, the guns, what they're doing and everything. Then when she gets to Lecter's actual cell, you get the absolute opposite of everything you've experienced so far. Because the setup is these dark, dank rooms with these crazy people in them, right? One smiling and has crazy eyes. Another guy's just staring blankly, and then Miggs, who's acting nuts. So you're thinking, what's this Lecter guy going to be like? and you come around the corner and he's calm and sophisticated, and you know he is from everything you're seeing in the room. Now, again, from the books, might have been totally different, but in the film, for just someone who wants a good experience, this is great. Like, this is really good. You're going, whoa, this is not what you're expecting. And it makes him come off as just entirely alien from what one would expect, and really, truly scary. Like, you're so glad that she's on the other side of that cell. And it's fascinating. And she leaves and starts crying because of the experience that she had. And you're thinking to yourself, man, she's in such a dark world. And how's she going to handle this? Great stuff. The other kind of person who wants to go into a film like this is the person who wants to be engaged intellectually, and it absolutely works at that level too. And this is one of the best introductions to a character ever. It's really good. Man, it's so genius. The first thing they do is do a little two-step. They do something very cliche, and I think it's intentional. I could be wrong, but I think it is. And what is it? Well, how do you have to get to Lecter's cell? Well, you have to descend, right? So she's descending into the bowels of this insane asylum. And when she gets to the bottom of the stairs, what's there? A red light, and it makes everything red. Now, what is that? It's so cliche, do I even have to say it? She's obviously descended into hell. Well, they set up expectations to subvert in the best possible way here as well. So she's traveling down these cells, and in every cell, what do you see? Darkness. You can barely see one of the guys in the cells. You can't make out who's in there very well. It's just dark. Anything could be happening in the darkness of that cell. And what's at the end of this tunnel? Light. His room, Lecter's room, is well lit and bright, and it's almost like saying he's the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I could be reading too much into that, but by the end of the scene, I don't think so, because there's an irony. And the irony is, by the end of the scene, that she ends up needing him. He is the light at the end of the tunnel. So there's the descent. It's really good in throwing off your senses, but also making you think one way and having it go another. Just, you're going to think this is going to be Satan himself, but instead, light. Which, by the way, is very biblical. Satan comes as an angel of light. He's not going to come as the bad guy, and that's kind of what happens here. Now, I need to introduce you to something on this, and that's the concept of a memory palace or a mind palace. It's very simple. It's in fact, you may have even done this. I know I have. We did at my old high school, we used to have these retreats, and you had one a year that just happened all day long in one of the buildings at the school. Pardon me. And then your last one, your senior year, you actually went off site for the weekend. And they had a psychologist or a psychiatrist there, and he taught us how to do a memory palace. And all it is just a technique, and you may have seen a waiter or waitress do this, where you give them your order, and they don't even take notes, and they get your order 100% right. They do better than someone that has to take notes. Why? Because there's a certain way in which this operates. And what you do in your mind is you create a tableau, which I'll explain in a minute, and then you interact that information with the tableau, okay? And then you basically set all this out in your mind, and it's all there. And it can be recalled for years very easily. And I've done this, and it works. It's very effective. Now, what is a tableau? Tableau is something like this. Let's say you're doing your bills. And you say, okay, I'm going to set, everything with my car here, and then here I'm going to put everything with my house and my groceries. That's a tableau. Okay, you're setting something out. That's a physical tableau. This is a cerebral tableau or mental tableau. Now, later on, you will hear that, Crawford says that he was talking, that Hannibal was talking to Miggs, that's the person in the cell next to him, all day, and Miggs was crying and then swallowed his own tongue and died. You may think to yourself, oh, that's Jedi mind trick kind of stuff, but it's done with psychology, and all that. It's actually better than that, man. It's a little more sophisticated than that, in my opinion. I think what he's done is he insinuates himself into someone else's mind palace or memory palace and changes their tableau. And when he convinces them they ought to do what's in the tableau he's put in their mind palace as opposed to what they do. And why I say this is that later on in the movies, and if you've watched a TV series, it's really well done. But in the movies, the movie Hannibal, and they're not great. Silence of the Lambs is the only one that's any good. But one of the characters cut off their own face, and he says, I just got in conversations and it just seemed like a good idea at the time. And you may think this is off the mark, but it's really not. When Clarice comes around the corner, what does she see in the cell besides Lecter? Everywhere is drawings. Drawings all over the cell. And she looks at one and she says, it's a picture that he's drawn from a rooftop, which is played out in the movie Hannibal, I believe. But she says, oh, is that a view or a memory? And he says, well, all I have now is the memories. So she doesn't realize it, but she's seeing his tableau. She's seeing his memory palace. Now, he says something. He's talked in an accent a few times. It's really strange. Like before he ever reveals why he's talking in an accent, but he does. It's really odd. And I used to think he just came off weird, that the audio recording was weird, but it isn't. So it shows that he's already analyzed her. Now, Crawford has already told her, don't let him get personal. You don't want Lecter rolling around in your head. What's he saying here? He doesn't want him insinuating himself in her memory palace. So she's talking and he says, to me, you look like a rube. You've got your nice expensive bag, but you got your cheap shoes. He's like, you look like you're trying to be somebody you're not. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. He says, he goes, and what about that accent? He goes, maybe West Virginia, where you live in a coal mine town. And he says, you made your way out all the way up to the FBI. And he's already beginning to do this. And so she says, she says something really stupid. She says, have you ever taken that intellect and turned it in on yourself? If you look around his room, that's all he's got left. That's all that's there. In fact, Chilton later will take this away from him. And he says he loves his petty torments. And so here you have all this. And he says to him, well, a census taker came to me one time and I ate his liver with fava beans and a nice Chianti. Who's going to analyze Lecter better than Lecter? She's not going to be able to. Anyway, they played her character, by the way, with this really good effeminate strength, man, that I love. And it's not feminism. I know that's the way they see it, but it's not. It's more universal than that. She was strong without being physically strong. It was really well done. So it leads me to my final point. This was way longer than I expected it to be. I apologize. I meant to keep it short, but there's so much to be said about this. But I do want to talk about one thing. Modern filmmakers, contemporary filmmakers, could not make this movie now. And the reason has to do with representation. Now, I want to be very careful because I don't think a lot of people really understand what representation is by what modern filmmakers are thinking. There's nothing wrong with more representation in terms of, hey, maybe we should show someone of a minority in a power position from time to time. I think that's great. I like the idea that they took so much. It's even more interesting artistically. It's interesting that this is about Clarice Starling and not about some guy who's some big buff dude that can handle himself in a physical fight. It would be way less interesting, right? So it's the issue isn't representation per se. The issues that we don't really fully grasp, I think, some of us, what representation really means. It's not just that a person represents another, a race or a gender. It's also the roles that they have, right? So in modern day, you can't show a female at a disadvantage with a male. That eliminates something like this. You can't make any good art. It actually destroys art. And the reason why is because it would be utterly predictable. A female, this is what's happening with Rings of Power right now. It's just completely predictable. Yeah, you can't have the female be at a disadvantage to a male. And if you don't like a particular race, we'll just show them at a constant disadvantage. And this is what you see in commercials and everything. Every white male is a complete moron loser. And again, not that that's that big. I don't really care what people think of me, whatever. But the reality is that it makes for terrible art. It's just terrible. So unfortunately, this could never be made today because Clarice could never be at a disadvantage, and she certainly couldn't need some guy, which she does. She's a pawn in a game between Crawford and Lecter. But I will say this is really interesting. She holds all the cards despite that. She holds the cards for the mere fact that she's a female. And Chilton noticed this. And Lecter misread it. Chilton says, Crawford was he was very wise sending you. You're just Lecter's taste. A little play on words. But Lecter saw it as a put down. And he misread what Crawford was really doing. I think he doesn't really respect Crawford. Now, we'll say this, one postscript thing. There's one more ingenious thing about the Mind Palace that's coming up. You might think, well, it's still just a Jedi mind trick, right? I mean, it doesn't really explain how he could insinuate himself into the Mind Palace, how he could assert his ideas into someone's tableau. The filmmaker has Lecter do this to Clarice, and through Clarice, he does it to the audience. Lecter will insert something from himself into your tableau, your Mind Palace, by the end of this film. What is it? We'll talk about it when it happens. All right, I hope the rest of these are not this long. People are going to see 20 some odd minutes and go, part one, really? But, if you like this movie, maybe you enjoy this. And there's certainly millions of things that could be said about this. Tons. But, I only know, I'm just trying to go off what I'm getting out of it this time that I'm watching it. Have a good one.